Hello everybody, welcome to our webinar on tracking and the tools available to them. Before we get into it, we must confess that somebody forgot to press the record button on the beginning of our last webinar, so I'm actually recording this content after the webinar has finished. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the same content and examples that I did at the beginning and then let you catch up with a live webinar midway through this video. So before we get into some Vista examples, I'd just like to explain what tracking is and why we still use that in our consoles today. So tracking was a concept that was kind of invented in the very early days of memory lighting consoles. At that point in time, the physical computing memory available in those consoles was very low, so there wasn't enough physical memory to store a whole theatre show. So what they came up with was this concept of tracking, which stated that if a fixture doesn't change from one queue to the next, don't store that information, only store things that change. Track forwards the rest, so therefore the amount of events in your queue list is less. And I have a little example of this here. This is a non-tracking example. So fixture 1 in Q1 is 100%, and in non-tracking you'd also have to store that event in Q2, Q3 and Q4 if you want that to stay on. We can say the same for fixture 2, it's at 50% and only changes in Q number 3. And fixture 3 comes on at 25% in Q3 in this example. So the total amount of stored events in a non-tracking console in this example would be 10. But if we take a look at the same thing in a tracking example, fixture 1 comes on at 100% in Q1, and this doesn't change throughout all 4 queues, so this event is tracked forwards into Q2, 3 and 4. In the fixture 2 example, this comes up at 50% in Q1, tracks forwards into Q number 2, and then we store the change, which is 100% in Q3, which then tracks forwards into Q4. And fixture 3 just doesn't do anything in the first 2 queues, but it is stored at 25% in Q3 and tracked forwards into Q number 4. So you can see the total programmed events is less in a tracking console. So this is what enabled them to store a whole theatre show, for example, on not a lot of computing memory. So fast forward to today, our consoles have pretty much unlimited physical computing memory. But what has changed is the technology that we now use in our stages. Originally, we were just working with fixtures that change intensity, so one feature, but now we work with fixtures that do position, color, gobo, focus, and all of that type of stuff. So in a non-tracking console, you'd have to reprogram all of those channels for every single light in every single queue. So we still use it today because it enables us to program efficiently. And it works great if you go from queue number 1 to queue a million. But where it could potentially cause problems if you start editing or adding stuff in the middle of that queue list, which subsequent queues later relied upon for their events, which is where console tools to help manage that help you. So I programmed a queue list in this example. Let's just edit that and take a look. So if I open up queue list number 1 now, I just have 8 queues. And if I show you the timeline view and just zoom that out, we can actually see tracking in place here. So let's just flick through the queues. We've got red, green, blue, cyan, magenta, yellow, and then we change to yellow up in the air in Q7, and Q8 is rainbow up in the air. So we can see tracking happening here. Intensity is tracked all the way through this queue list because we don't change intensity at all. Position is tracked through Q2 to 7 until we see a new position event in 7, and then this position event in 7 is tracked forwards into queue number 8 as well. In most cases, we are changing color in every single queue apart from queue number 7, where we don't change that when we move from the singer to up in the air, so therefore the yellow is tracked forwards into queue number 7 until we see a change again on queue number 8. So the timeline's really nice to be able to see what's happening in your queue list. If you actually want to see the tracked events themselves, you can hold down the Control or Command key on a keyboard or your yellow console modifier and press Show Tracked Events. When this option is turned on, when you're clicking on your cues, you do actually see a little faded out event. You can't click the events here, of course, because they're actually coming from the source information, but that just gives you an idea that there is stuff tracking forwards to create the look of this cue when we play into them. So let's just turn that off for now. So if I show you some examples of where tracking can potentially cause you problems, if I edit cue number 4 here, the cyan, and let's just change the position to about my band preset, so that looks nice. We could then go off and change cues in this direction, 7, 8 and onwards from here, and everything looks great. We then come back to number 1, this looks great, 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 this is good too. But the problem potentially is now, if I wasn't aware of tracking, is that the magenta and the yellow cue are now using this band position for their information because that's tracking forwards from Q5 into Q6 and 7. Sometimes this is desirable, but you might have intended to actually go back to the singer on this magenta and yellow cue just here. So how can you fix that? Well, you could program the position for the singer manually in this cue. You could copy and paste it or just apply it, but it's actually much easier to use the first tool, which is untrack events. So to do that, we will select the events in cue number 4, right click, and then we can come down to untrack events here. As soon as we click this, the console will fix itself in the next cue and program whatever events need to be in there. So that's useful, certainly if you hadn't originally programmed these positions on presets. So just to recap on that again, we just select the events that we want to untrack, right click and press untrack events, and then Vista will automatically program the correct events for tracking to follow on as normal in the next cues. So that tool's handy if you've programmed something ahead and then you realize, oh, I need to untrack that. But if you know tracking is going to happen before you actually program the new event, you can use a different tool which is called cue only editing. And this tool is on the tools menu drop down, and it's the top one. It's called cue only editing. When it's on, it's red. This is the only indication that this is actually active. But as you can see in my show file, you can actually bring this up to a soft key if you find yourself using it quite often. And just to recap on how to change the soft keys, you just right click them and then choose the option from here. So currently cue only editing is on. And when this feature is on, it means that you're only changing this cue. Don't have that track forwards into the next cue. So let's do that same example again. We'll just change the position in cue number 4, but because this function is now on, as soon as I apply it, it immediately fixes itself in terms of the correct program events in cue number 5. So it returns to the singer, which track forwards into cue number 6 in this example. So this feature isn't only to do with fixtures that are already in the cue list. This would also happen to new fixtures that you're programming. So if I jump back to my fixture chooser view, and let's just choose some profiles and park hands and turn these fixtures on, because this cue only editing is still on, what we see as soon as we do that is the console's automatically adding release events to turn those off in the next cue, so they're only cue only in cue number 4. You can toggle this on and off for certain fixtures as well. So because I've toggled it off now, if I was to go back to my fixture chooser and add in some red park hands, what would happen now is the blue and white lights would fade off in this cue, but the red lights would track forwards through the rest of this cue list because that function was turned off there. So that's what cue only editing is. I'm just going to press Ctrl Z a couple of times just to undo all of this and go back to my nice example just here. And I'll just save the cue list for a moment. You can also find cue only in the store part and update buttons as well. If I just do that same example again, for example here, if I use store part, and let's just say update the second queue, we'll merge the update. You can see that there is an option to update queues queue only from here as well. So this would fade out when we go to queue number 3. So let's just show you that. Let's clear the programmer and let's play our list. So this is queue number 1. Queue number 2 is the addition of these fixtures that we've just added, but because we still had that store part and queue only checked, these are automatically removed in the next queue. So you can find this in a couple of places. Again, I'm just going to undo that just to get that back to our nice queue list. So that's a quick example of explanation of queue only editing. Let's go back into my queue list and take a look at the next section that I'd like to talk about, which is block queues. Let's just collapse the intensity a little bit here. So when you block a queue, what you're doing is you're basically putting a blockade before the start of the queue that you're blocking. So in this example, let's do the magenta queue actually. Let's block this. To block a queue, you can be within the live edit. You right click the queue and press block queue, or Control B, the keyboard shortcut. So when we block a queue, anything that was previously tracked in to create the look of this queue is placed in here as a real event. So you can now see I've got my intensity and singers programmed as actual events in here. So what does this mean? This means, of course, that we can then go and change anything in the queues before. So if we change the position again in queue number 3, we could even change some intensities in Q4. Because we blocked it before we made these changes, when we then play into queue number 5, that's playing back exactly as it is at the time we blocked it. Blocking 2 doesn't just account for fixtures that you had at the time of the programming. It would account for new fixtures too. So let me show you another example where we're going to add in some new fixtures in Q2. Let's go back to the fixture chooser, and just to demonstrate this, we'll bring in the park items and profiles again. Here they are. So what would happen now is these fixtures would track forwards into queue number 3 and 4, but when we play the blocked queue, this new information will be automatically released for us because it wasn't in the queue when we blocked it. So basically, if you block a queue, you're saying play this queue exactly as it is at the time you blocked it. And if I just show you the programmed events here, you can see this is the automatic block release of this. For this reason, you might find a lot of people block a blackout queue because it needs to be a blackout. Therefore, it doesn't matter if they're adding lights before it. When they play that blackout queue, they know it's going to be exactly as they had it, and Vista will automatically turn the lights off when you play that block queue. It's also common practice to block out certain sections of your queue list. If you imagine you've got a theatrical queue stack, you might want to block each scene segment. So if you're working on a certain scene that spans a number of queues, you can make changes which will track forwards to the end of that scene segment, safe for the knowledge that the next segment is completely blocked out and safe from any changes tracking forwards from the previous scenes. So that's an explanation of blocking. The last thing that I need to explain is, well, what is super blocking? So if I do the same examples again, I'm just going to undo all of those changes that I made in this queue list, so we're back to normal. And for this next example, I'll just program another queue list. So this is the queue list we've been working on before. I'm just going to change my HTTP off on this queue list, and we'll make a new queue list 5. And let's go for these same dimmers just here. So the dimmers are in list 5, which are on this fader just here. So super blocking within a queue list actually does the same thing as just blocking in terms of the tracked information coming into this queue list. To super block a queue, you can right click it and press super block, Control Shift B. So you can see all of this information is placed in here. But you may have noticed that it's turned this queue list off as well. And that's actually the primary difference of super blocking. Super blocking affects other queue lists as well, whereas blocking just affects the queue list you're working on at the time. So if I show you this, let's play Q1 red, and then I'll play my blue parkouts and profiles here. Of course, when I'm playing the first queue list, this is all fine, they're all working together here. But when I come to my Q5, because that's the super blocked, what will happen is queue list 5 here will be inhibited. So that those levels have been taken out because that wasn't the look of this queue here. So everything else has been inhibited. It's important to mention that even if we go past queue number 5 into 6 and 7, we don't see this 5 coming back on again. It doesn't do that automatically because how would it know? So if we want to play this again, all we have to do is reassert it, which is play again, and then those levels will return to stage. So that's the difference between blocking and super blocking. Super blocking will inhibit other active queue lists on stage, just to give you the look of the queue that you super blocked. So with that explanation, we can now hopefully join the live webinar with all the questions and chat that was going on there. So the next kind of topics that I want to talk about briefly is copying and pasting queues and alias queues. They're not really to do with tracking, but there are some options in there which reference tracking, so therefore we thought it would be a good opportunity to explain those in this webinar. So we'll take the sign example on my singer. As some of you may know, one of the easiest ways to copy a queue within the live edit is actually to click and drag it. So if I drag Q4 to in between 5 and 6 just here, I get a copy of this queue over there, which is great. We can see that in there. But with Vista, we actually deal with copying the look of the queue by default. So the look of this queue is cyan on my singer, even though the events of the queue are actually just the color information, because the position and intensity is tracked forwards from Q1. It's not actually stored in these queues, but yet this is the look of the queue. So the reason we're explaining this is if I just zoom in a little bit more over here and just come to the end of my queue list, if I copy this queue over here, Vista will automatically add in whatever events it needs to recreate the look of that queue. So like I mentioned, the singer wasn't stored in the queue that I've just copied, but the console knows that it needs to change from the up position, tracking forwards from Q6 here. It then tracks forwards to the rainbow, but then changes from the rainbow back down to the singer in queue number 8. So that's why we're talking about it in this webinar, because it is taking the tracked look when we copy and paste something by default. If I just undo this example a couple of times, and this time I'll do the same example, but I'll use a different feature called Paste Special. The easiest way that I can teach you to do this is to still use that same drag and drop action, but hold down the red modifier console key or the shift key on your keyboard. So if I do the same action again, let's take a look. We get the Paste Special menu. Copying and pasting the look of the queue is exactly the same thing that I've just shown you by dragging and dropping, but we do have this additional pop-up option, this window here. So the second option here is to paste only the events of the original queue, brackets non-track. So don't take that tracks look, just give me the events of the original queue, which in this example is just the events programmed, which is just the color. So the look of the paste will be completely different now. We've pasted just the events of the queue, which therefore means the position is up in the air because that's coming from queue number 6, like that. So that's pasting the events non-tracked. What we mentioned it There is another option available there. It's not really to do with tracked events, but it's called an alias queue. So we'll demonstrate what that means. If I alias Q4, then we'll just put that after magenta again. So I'm still holding down that red modifier key or shift. This time I'm going to select an alias queue. So an alias queue puts a link between the same queues in your queue list. So this is useful if you've got a repetitive stage queue. You only have to update one of them. So you can see if I take queue 5.5, anything that I change in this queue will be automatically updating the queues of that same alias. And you can have a number of this same queue aliased. So if I take this one here, you can see when it's updating the other two versions of this as well. We can see in the queue tile that it's got alias at the top. And if you want to see which queue is aliased to another one, because of course you could have different queues aliasing different queues in your list, you can right click and press queue properties. And towards the middle here, you can see alias queue. So this is telling you that this 4.7 is an alias of Q4 and Q5.5 as well. If you have aliased a queue and you want to make this standalone, so not affect the others, the way that we can do that is right click on the queue tile and come down to remove queue alias. So when you press this action, this queue would then become standalone, just as normal, and it wouldn't be linked to the other queues anymore. So that's what an alias queue is. I'm just pressing undo just to get back to my single sign queue. But alias queue only works with the events of the queue itself. So if I alias Q4 to the end of my list, here it is. So these two queues are an alias of each other, but the look is different based on the tracked information that's going into it. So you can see that they're still linked together, but in Q4 here, it's on the singer because this is tracked from queue number 1, but in queue number 8, this is the same colored queue, but it's getting its information from queue number 6. Just another tip, you can actually alias multiple queues or copy and paste queues together. So if I select a queue 2, 3, and 4, I could alias this somewhere else in my queue list. And then the green is linking to the greens, the blue is linking to the blues, and so on. So that can be a real quick way of taking an entire section of your list and copying it to somewhere else.
Question came up: can we stack alias and blocking on a single queue?
Yes, you can actually. That's normally something that I would demonstrate in that example. So let's take it that you want to alias Q4 to queue number 8, which I just demonstrated with the sign up in the air. If I want to make that the same, personally, I'd actually just block the queue. So if I block queue number 4 first, that's putting all that tracked information into here. So that's as is. And then if I alias this out to queue number 8, we've then got a copy of it. So it's going to change down to the singer because we blocked that before we did it. And of course, now they're exactly the same. Or you could have copied and pasted it. It's really up to you, but you can combine it. Most cases that would actually work. Whether it's the best programming practice for this feature, I guess that depends on what other stuff might be automatically removed from what you might have added here, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that works there. Read through questions right now. Queue view, make change in a future queue while still in an active queue. That's something we did yesterday. At least I did
I mean,
yesterday.
we can go through it here because we didn't have
Yeah.
the visualizer connected yesterday, so we're changing topic completely now. Nothing to do with tracking, but so I'll just turn. It's all to do with these two options here: queue view and link. And the crucial thing when you're working in the live edit is this yellow box. This yellow box here tells you what queue you're currently editing. If I just jump back to the timeline view, sorry, the fixture chooser view, this is going to be much clearer. So when you're playing through your queue list, the queue that you are editing is the queue that's currently playing on stage. So the two are synchronized together. So this is the queue that we're editing, and this is also the queue that's playing to stage. Let's jump back to queue number one. If you click away from a queue, let's go to the magenta queue just here. As soon as you click into a queue, you will automatically engage something called queue view. And what this is a visual blind representation of this queue that we're editing. Again, yellow box. You see the yellow box in the fixer chooser. But what's playing to stage is Q1 red because that's still playing over here. And we can see that in WYSIWYG. So I could be making some changes in my magenta queue list. And I can see that on here. But I could still be playing back the queue list if I need to whilst I'm busy making all these edits. So I'm just playing through this queue list as normal from here.
So let's bring this back to where tracking comes into to play with this. Is what happens if you change a queue that's before the queue you're currently in. So we're sitting in queue 5 right now, and we go into queue view and we make a change in a previous queue.
Let's.
What will happen then?
You'd actually see it straight away, I believe. Let's just double check that. In fact, we can do it from magenta. If we go to queue view and we'll go to blue, if I change this here, if I change this to the band, I would expect to see that change immediately, even though you're doing it in blind. And it's correct behavior when you're working in this list because you as soon as you make a change, you are actually applying it in here straight away. So that is actually the correct behavior in this example.
Yeah. So what's happening is it's tracking forward. So if you're making a change ahead of time, that's going to continue to track. Uh, so using queue view for queues that are before the queue you're in uh, might not be the best way of doing it. That might be where there's some of the other options could come in. Like I guess if you're outside, you could do the store part with queue only. But yeah, so if you're seeing, I'm just going back to the question here, Dietrich had about if you're changing to a future queue, he's used queue view a few times and it's come out of the queue. There are times my active queue came out of the queue and went to the queue I was trying to adjust in queue view, and that could have happened if you clicked link there as well. So
Link is the only option that would do that. It wouldn't skip back normally. If you're in queue view, even if you've surpassed it, so I'm queue view in Q6 now. Even if we go to Q7, we stay in the queue that we've selected until we turn off queue view. When you turn off queue view, the queue that you are then editing will be synchronized back up to the currently playing queue. The only way you'd get the output to go, say, to here, where Q4 is if you click link. When you click a link, the output will actually snap there as soon as you click it.
does that answer your question there, Dietrich? I'm trying to see what's if there's anything else there. Yeah, that works for that one. Okay. If there's any other questions, I haven't seen any other questions. I've been answering some as they come up. Um, Dan had a question earlier about the uh, if you stored intensity at 0 in the first queue and skipped a queue, or I mean, actually, we could broaden that out to if you skip a queue no matter what. Because it is tracking, it's gonna still look at that. It's just because you skipped it in the active playback doesn't mean that looks not still there unless you go into a blocking queue. But it's probably important to also point out that if you have an intensity set at 0 in a queue, it stays at 0 until you tell it to change again. So how would you, Jack? What would you recommend for something like that? If you want to if you have an intensity program at 0, I mean the difference between a hard value of 0 and a release value might be handy to kind of touch on.
I'm trying to think of an example. I can't think of an example in my head to demonstrate that. So let's just see if we can talk as we go through it. So let's say, let's take, I don't know, queue number 4, and let's turn off the center 2 spots for example, the center two spots would be tracking forwards off through the rest of this queue list. And we're saying if we go from queue number uh, 3 to skip this queue and go to 4.5, we would expect these lights still to be off in this queue. Was that the question? Just to ask if that would happen, or
The question was if you had it all off in the first queue, would they stay off? Which
yeah,
they would because it's
absolutely,
a
yeah.
hard value.
It's the same thing exactly.
Yeah.
So if we turn the lights off in, oops, I just deleted it, but if we turn them off, these are off throughout the queue list until you find events and turn them on. So yeah, the tracking still happens. So every um, event that you programmed. One thing that might actually be good to talk about is the opposite of that. Actually, if we turn these lights back on in this example, is what happens if you delete Q1 red in this example. So if I delete the Q with the red minus at the top, I'll show you the normal action first, which is just a normal delete. So we're deleting all of this information in Q number 1. So therefore, this is key number 2. It's absolutely correct. We've got the green information here. We've deleted the intensity and the position, which all of this queue list relied upon for their actual look. So in most cases, this queue list is completely messed up now. If I press undo, and that's what the queue only delete is, this tick box here. What will happen now is any events that were meant to be tracking forwards will be kind of bumped forwards into queue number 2. So if I demonstrate this, what we see from deleting queue number 1 red is that the intensity and position is reprogrammed in this queue list. So look at the queue list is now exactly the same. We've just deleted that red portion beforehand. So
That actually answered a question of someone who said that their students often delete Q1. So
yeah, right.
that's a great
So
way to put that there too.
yeah,
Um, as an example for release events, I was thinking, you know, kind of going back to live overriding something. If you program a release event in something, so my example would be is if you have two queue lists running, and one is sending intensity for something, or position. Let's say position for these fixtures. So your one queue list is nothing but position. Another queue list has your intensity and your color and whatnot in it, and it has some position in there. If this queue list is running, it's going to continue to override. It will override the other position because it's a latest takes precedence. So if you add a release event in, so say your Q, what is that, Q6, if you're up or you had a release event in there instead, it would actually release the control
yeah. So it
of
would
that to the other queue list rather
exactly.
than
So you can never see position in this list itself. So to convert to a release event, you can just right click it and press convert to release event. Of course, if the position would or the feature would then return to its home value or anything else that might be playing. In this case, it would be another list in your example.
yeah.
So hard.
It's just another way of explaining what that is, and that it's different from programming a hard value in there. It's releasing all the values of just those values without releasing the whole
Yeah, it's
list.
the same thing. Like we said about with the tracking, when we jump to a queue or play a queue. For example, if I play any of these queues here from another list, in fact, we can do an example of this. Let me just do a new queue list here. I'll just put the lights on my front edge. Let's just bring this over here. So this is the last action on the front. But if I now play the magenta queue, we reassert the tracked information. So even though we're only actually playing magenta in this Q5, we're actually reasserting the tracked look. So these two will kind of just fight themselves now on an LTP basis. If I go to Q number 6, they'll go back to the front. And then in this other queue, we're probably going to go back to there again in this tracked information. So what Ben was saying, I think, is if we just program another event in here, and we'll convert that to a release event, you can see it's returned back to the last action, which was 6. So now it doesn't matter if I'm playing queue number 5 or 6, there's nothing to reassert because you released the event. Whereas if I go back to a queue in the middle, which is Q4, there is something to reassert in this case. So I'd come to the front, I'd play into here, it would reassert. But now when I play this, it would go back to doing whatever it was doing underneath. I think that was your example, wasn't it, Ben?
Yep, that was exactly what I was thinking there. Some of these other questions are topics we're going to have on other webinars. We're going to do QList properties in other webinars. QList properties, Q properties, we have a whole list of things for that because that's its own, pretty much its own thing. Adding music tracks to Vista, again, that's something else that we're going to do later on, and also MIDI. So yeah, we have lots of other things scheduled for the next couple weeks. We're not going to do a basic webinar again. We're going to just go advanced topics from here on out. So connecting WYSIWYG, there are some write-ups on that already. Mainly you have to do it. How are you doing this with the ArtNet, Jack?
Yeah, I'm using it like that, yeah.
Okay, and there's a little thing called Luminex Wiggleizer that you throw in there that basically loops it back to itself.
I don't think we'll do a webinar on that, but we could make a short tutorial video.
Yep. Let's see, what else here? When using a queue, moving something on live, fader stops responding. How do I change that? Most likely.
That's because you've changed it in live. So if we take a look at this as an example here, let's just go for this example. So here's my queue list, which is playing. Let's go to this. On this here. So yeah, I've got control over intensity. If you make a change in live, let's just put that back to 100%. The programmer, so the live tab, has the highest priority in the console. So if you turn this off, for example, or even down at 27%, this would appear to do nothing because you've locked this in at whatever value you're programming here. So this appears to be doing nothing, but it is playing, it is working. It's just that the programmer has a higher priority. So if we clear the programmer, which is the answer to your question, is look out for it and clear your programmer, and then you'll see that it starts working again.
All right, I'm looking through some other things here. I've answered a lot of questions in the chat, so it's been going through pretty fast. There might be some things we missed. As for the icons in your quick picker, like I said, shoot us an email at vistasupport@chroma-q.com, and the icons are probably there, or we can add them in manually to the shows folder. So those are some of the things outside of this webinar. Copy and pasting cues between shows. You can't copy and paste between shows the way we've been doing this. You can copy and paste.
Merge it, and then you could merge it and then copy and paste it as normal.
Yeah. Merging would be the way to go with that. You can copy and paste cues between queue lists, but using the same way we've been doing this, but not shows themselves.
We have some time, Dawn, if you want to go your question. That's okay. I'm not using a physical console today either.
Let's see. There was something brought up about moving black earlier. We're going to put that in a future webinar as well. It's a little more involved. Yeah, feel free to ask any questions now. We've got time here too.
Simple one. So whenever we store something, be it through any of the store windows, be it store all or store part, or even if you make a new queue list directly, whenever you do this, we are actually storing to the queue list component. So you can see my 6 lists that I've got here. To assign them to a virtual console playback, all we need to make sure is we've still got queue list selected from the top right of this screen. And then it's just a case of simply clicking and dragging into a virtual LCD playback. So this is how we can move stuff around and assign them to pages. We just drag and drop. And again, if you go webinar on sort of console operation and setting up keys and playbacks, we will be doing that in a dedicated webinar as well. So like Ben mentioned, I think we've got at least another 3 or 4 weeks of 2 webinars a week scheduled, which we'll be announcing shortly.
Yeah, and priorities between queue lists corresponds with the queue list properties and all that as well. That's been brought up a number of times though today is priorities in queue lists. So we hear you on that one.
Excellent. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you once again for joining us. And like I said, we will be hosting more next Wednesday and Thursday as well. So we hope to see you there.